Marcus Rodriguez never believed in fairy tales or monster stories until the morning he watched his neighbor devour his mailman. The emergency broadcast had been playing for 3 days straight, but most people in Millfield thought it was another government hoax. Marcus had been one of those skeptics, rolling his eyes at the grainy footage of shambling figures and panicked reporters. Now, crouched behind his kitchen window, he watched Mrs. Patterson tear into poor Eddie's throat with teeth that seemed far too sharp for an 80-year-old woman. The transformation had been swift and brutal. What started as isolated incidents in major cities had spread like wildfire across suburban America. Marcus grabbed his phone with trembling fingers, trying to call his sister Amanda who lived across town, but the cellular towers had gone dark hours ago. The landlines were dead too. Whatever had caused this plague had also systematically destroyed communication networks, leaving communities isolated and vulnerable. Marcus lived alone in a modest 2-story house that his late father had left him. The house sat on a corner lot with decent sight lines in all directions, which now seemed like a blessing rather than a curse. He could see the chaos unfolding throughout his neighborhood. The Jenkins family next door had barricaded themselves inside their garage, while across the street, the Williams house stood ominously quiet with its front door hanging wide open. The first priority was securing his home. Marcus had always been handy with tools, a skill his father had insisted upon during countless weekend projects. He dragged his father's heavy workbench against the front door and began nailing boards across the lower-level windows. The sound of hammering seemed deafeningly loud in the eerie silence that had settled over the neighborhood. Every few minutes, he would pause and listen for the telltale sounds of approaching danger. By noon, Marcus had fortified the ground floor as best he could with the materials at hand. He gathered all the food from his kitchen and pantry, creating an inventory that painted a grim picture. 3 cans of soup, a box of crackers, some peanut butter, and a few bottles of water. Maybe enough for a week if he rationed carefully. The electricity was still working, but he suspected that wouldn't last long. From his bedroom window, Marcus could see smoke rising from the downtown area. The distant sound of sirens had stopped around dawn, replaced by an unsettling quiet broken only by occasional screams and the sound of breaking glass. He tried his battery-powered radio, cycling through static until he found a weak signal from a station claiming to broadcast from a military base 2 hours north. The message was repetitive and disturbing. Stay indoors, avoid contact with infected individuals, and wait for official rescue operations. As afternoon approached, Marcus noticed movement in the street below. A group of survivors had emerged from the apartment complex at the end of his block. He counted 7 people, including what looked like 2 children. They moved cautiously, carrying backpacks and looking around nervously. The group was led by a woman with short blonde hair who seemed to be giving directions to the others. The survivors made their way down the street, checking abandoned cars for supplies and trying doors of empty houses. Marcus watched them approach the Harrison house, where old Mr. Harrison had lived alone for 20 years. The front door opened easily and the group disappeared inside. Minutes later, they emerged quickly, the woman shaking her head and ushering the children away from the house. Marcus could only imagine what they had found inside. One of the men in the group pointed toward Marcus's house, and he instinctively stepped back from the window. They had noticed his fortifications, the boarded windows and blocked entrance that marked his house as occupied. The group gathered on the sidewalk, clearly debating their next move. The woman looked up at his second-story window, and for a moment, their eyes met across the distance. Marcus faced an impossible decision. These people were clearly desperate and in need of shelter, but letting them in meant sharing his limited resources and potentially compromising his security. He had no way of knowing if any of them were infected or if they could be trusted. The children in the group tugged at his conscience, but survival often demanded harsh choices. As the group continued to stare at his house, Marcus realized that the comfortable isolation he had created for himself was about to be tested. The blonde woman stepped forward and called out in a voice that carried clearly in the still air. "We know someone's in there. We're not infected and we have children with us. Please, we just need a safe place for the night." Her voice carried a note of desperation that made Marcus's chest tighten. He could see the exhaustion in their postures, the way the children clung to the adults, and the nervous glances they cast over their shoulders. Marcus moved away from the window and sat on his bed, his mind racing. Every survival instinct told him to stay hidden, to wait until they moved on to someone else's problem. But the rational part of his brain knew that eventually he would need allies. One person alone could not survive indefinitely in this new world. Sleep would become a luxury he couldn't afford, and eventually his defenses would fail. After 20 minutes of agonizing deliberation, Marcus made his choice. He moved his workbench away from the front door and slowly opened it, keeping the chain lock engaged. Through the narrow gap, he could see the group had moved closer, hope evident in their faces. "I'll let you in," he called out, "but I need to check each of you first. Anyone showing signs of illness stays outside." The woman nodded eagerly. "I'm Lisa Thompson. This is my brother Michael, his wife Janet, and their kids Emma and Tyler. These are our neighbors, Ben Walsh and his daughter Katie." She gestured to each person as she spoke. "We've been together since yesterday morning, and none of us have been bitten or exposed." Marcus studied each face carefully. The children looked frightened but alert, their eyes clear and focused. The adults showed signs of stress and fatigue but no obvious symptoms of infection. He had read enough online before the internet went down to know that the change from human to infected happened quickly and was unmistakable. One by one he allowed them inside, checking each person for bite marks or scratches. Lisa was clearly the group's leader, making decisions and organizing their movements with calm efficiency. Michael appeared to be in his 40s, with the soft build of someone who worked behind a desk, but his eyes held the determined look of a man protecting his family. Janet was quiet but observant, keeping her children close while scanning the house's defenses with an appraising eye. Ben Walsh was perhaps 60 years old, with graying hair and calloused hands that spoke of manual labor. His teenage daughter Katie had the sullen expression typical of her age, but Marcus noticed how she positioned herself where she could see all the exits. These people had learned quickly that survival meant constant vigilance. Once everyone was inside, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. His supplies would now need to feed 8 people instead of 1. The house that had felt secure with a single occupant now seemed cramped and vulnerable. Lisa seemed to understand his concerns without being told. "We have some food with us," she offered, opening her backpack to reveal several cans and bottles of water. "And Ben used to be a contractor. He knows about fortifications and security." Ben nodded, already examining the boards Marcus had nailed over the windows. "Good instincts," he said approvingly, "but we can make this place a lot stronger." The group settled into an uneasy routine as evening approached. Michael and Janet kept their children occupied with quiet games while the adults discussed their situation in hushed tones. The consensus was grim but realistic. They needed to find a more defensible location with better access to supplies, but traveling during daylight was dangerous, and moving at night was nearly suicidal. As darkness fell over Millfield, the true horror of their situation became apparent. The sounds that drifted through the boarded windows were unlike anything from the normal world. Shuffling footsteps, low moaning sounds, and occasionally, the terrifying noise of breaking glass or splintering wood as the infected forced their way into buildings. The children had fallen asleep despite the circumstances, but the adults took turns keeping watch, peering through small gaps in their fortifications. Around midnight, Marcus was startled awake by Lisa's urgent whisper. A large group of infected had gathered in the street outside, drawn perhaps by some sound or scent they couldn't identify. Through a crack in the boards, Marcus counted at least 15 figures shambling aimlessly in the moonlight. Some wore the remnants of normal clothes, while others were so damaged that their humanity was barely recognizable. The group held their breath and remained perfectly still as the infected wandered past the house. One creature, wearing what had once been a postal uniform, paused directly in front of Marcus's door and stood motionless for several terrifying minutes before moving on. The message was clear: their sanctuary was temporary at best, and tomorrow would bring new challenges that would test their unity and their will to survive. Dawn brought no relief from the tension that had gripped the house throughout the night. Marcus woke to find Lisa already awake, sitting by the window and keeping watch over the street. The infected had moved on during the early morning hours, leaving behind only scattered debris and dark stains on the pavement that no one wanted to examine too closely. The group gathered in Marcus's living room to plan their next move. Ben had spent the night sketching rough diagrams of potential escape routes and defensive positions. His contractor's knowledge proved invaluable as he explained the structural weaknesses of typical suburban homes and how they might be exploited by desperate people or persistent infected. "We can't stay here much longer," Ben announced, spreading his papers on the coffee table. "This house is well positioned, but it's not built for a long siege. The windows are too large, the doors too flimsy, and we don't have adequate supplies for 8 people. He pointed to several locations on his hand-drawn map of the neighborhood. "We need to think about the elementary school, the fire station, or maybe the old warehouse district." Michael shook his head emphatically. "The school is too big to defend and everyone will have the same idea. It'll be a death trap." His wife Janet nodded in agreement, unconsciously pulling their children closer. Emma and Tyler had been remarkably brave throughout the ordeal, but the strain was beginning to show in their increasingly quiet behavior. Lisa studied Ben's map carefully. What about the fire station? It's built like a fortress and there might be useful equipment there. She traced a route with her finger. It's about 8 blocks from here, mostly residential streets. If we move early in the morning when the infected are less active, we might make it. Katie Walsh spoke up for the first time since arriving. My dad and I walked past there yesterday. The big bay doors were closed but we saw smoke coming from the chimney. Someone's already there. The teenagers' observation brought a sobering reality to their planning. Other survivors meant potential allies, but also competition for resources and possible conflict. Marcus felt the weight of leadership settling uncomfortably on his shoulders. These people looked to him for guidance, perhaps because it was his house or simply because he had been the first to make the hard decisions. We need more information before we commit to anything, he decided. Someone should scout the area around the fire station while the rest of us prepare to move if necessary. Ben volunteered immediately. I'm the oldest and most expendable. If something happens to me, the group still has parents and caregivers for the children. His matter-of-fact tone about his own mortality sent a chill through the room, but Marcus recognized the logic. In this new world, every decision carried life or death consequences. While Ben prepared for his reconnaissance mission, the others organized their meager supplies and discussed contingency plans. Marcus found himself drawn to the children, who had adapted to their situation with the remarkable resilience that seemed unique to young minds. Emma, who couldn't be more than 8 years old, had taken charge of organizing the group's medical supplies, while her younger brother Tyler had appointed himself as the official water ration monitor. Janet watched her children with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. They shouldn't have to grow up like this, she whispered to Marcus. Last week, Emma's biggest worry was whether she'd get picked for the school play. Now she's learning how to treat infected bites and discussing which buildings offer the best defense against monsters. The weight of responsibility for these innocent lives added another layer of pressure to their situation. Every choice they made would affect not just their own survival, but the future of children who deserved better than this nightmare world. Marcus realized that their fight was no longer just about staying alive. It was about preserving some semblance of humanity and hope for the next generation. Ben returned from his scouting mission with disturbing news. The fire station was indeed occupied, but not by survivors as they had hoped. Through binoculars, he had observed at least 20 infected individuals wandering around the building's perimeter. The smoke Katie had seen was coming from an uncontrolled fire in the building's rear section, suggesting that whatever survivors had been there were either dead or had fled. The warehouse district might be our best option, Ben reported, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Most of the buildings are empty, and there's better visibility in all directions. The downside is that it's further away, and we'd have to cross the main commercial strip where infected activity seems heaviest during daylight hours. As they debated their options, a new sound reached their ears, the distant rumble of heavy engines approaching from the north. Through gaps in their window barricades, they could see military vehicles moving slowly down the main road several blocks away. Hope flickered in every face as they watched the convoy of armored trucks and personnel carriers. Lisa grabbed the battery-powered radio and frantically cycled through channels, hoping to establish contact with the military unit. Static filled the air until she found a weak signal broadcasting emergency instructions. The message was brief and terrifying. Evacuation zones were being established, but only for individuals who could prove they were uninfected, and transportation was limited. The convoy stopped about 6 blocks away, and through Ben's binoculars, they could see soldiers setting up a perimeter and processing a small group of survivors. The military's presence offered hope, but also raised difficult questions about their group's chances of reaching the evacuation point safely and whether they would all be accepted for transport. Marcus looked around at the faces of his makeshift family and realized that their fight for survival had entered a new phase. The next few hours would determine whether they remained together or were separated by circumstances beyond their control. Outside, the sound of helicopter rotors added urgency to their decision-making process, and the time for careful planning was rapidly running out. The decision to attempt reaching the military evacuation point was not made lightly. Through Ben's binoculars, they watched as soldiers processed survivors with clinical efficiency, separating people into different groups for reasons they couldn't understand from their distant vantage point. Some individuals were loaded into trucks and driven away, while others were directed to a cordoned area that looked uncomfortably like a quarantine zone. We don't have enough information, Michael argued, his protective instincts flaring as he watched his children prepare for what could be their final journey together. What if they separate families? What if they don't have room for all of us? His concerns were valid, but staying in the house was no longer an option. Their food supplies would last perhaps 2 more days, and the infected seemed to be growing more numerous and aggressive. Lisa made the final decision with characteristic determination. We go together and we stay together. If they won't take all of us, then we find another way. Her words carried the weight of leadership, but Marcus could see the uncertainty behind her confident facade. None of them truly knew what awaited them at the evacuation point. The group spent an hour preparing for their journey. Ben rigged a simple alarm system using cans and string that would alert them if infected entered the house after their departure, though they all knew they would never return. Marcus took one last look around the home his father had built, memorizing details that would soon exist only in his memories. They moved in a tight formation with Ben and Marcus taking point, Lisa and the children protected in the center, and Michael and Janet covering their rear. Katie Walsh had proven surprisingly adept at moving quietly and served as their scout, checking intersections and potential hiding spots ahead of the main group. The first 3 blocks passed without incident. The residential streets were eerily quiet, with most houses showing signs of hasty abandonment or worse. Cars sat with their doors hanging open, personal belongings scattered on lawns, and windows broken from the inside out. The infected seemed to be drawn toward areas with higher concentrations of survivors, leaving these suburban streets temporarily clear. Their luck changed as they approached the commercial district. The main shopping area that had once been the heart of Millfield's community life was now a wasteland of shattered storefronts and overturned vehicles. Worse, they could see infected wandering among the debris, drawn by some instinct to gather in places where humans had once congregated. Ben held up his hand, signaling the group to take cover behind an overturned delivery truck. Through the gaps beneath the vehicle, they could see at least a dozen infected shuffling aimlessly through the shopping center's parking lot. The military checkpoint was visible beyond the commercial area, perhaps half a mile away, but reaching it would require crossing this dangerous open ground. "We could go around," Janet whispered, "take the long way through the residential areas." But even as she spoke, they could see infected emerging from side streets, their movements becoming more purposeful as if responding to some signal the humans couldn't detect. The creatures were converging on their area, and their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Marcus made a command decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "We run for it. Stay low, move fast, and don't stop for anything or anyone." The words felt like acid in his throat, but survival sometimes demanded abandoning the luxury of moral choices. Emma began to cry softly, understanding that her childhood had truly ended in this moment. They broke cover and ran, abandoning stealth for speed. Their footsteps echoed off the empty storefronts, and within seconds the infected had detected their presence. The creatures moved with surprising coordination, cutting off potential escape routes and forcing the group toward the military checkpoint through the most dangerous path possible. Tyler stumbled and fell, scraping his knee on the broken asphalt. Without hesitation, Ben scooped up the boy and continued running, his contractor's strength carrying the extra weight without apparent effort. Behind them, the infected were closing ground, their shambling gait becoming a disturbing approximation of a run. The military checkpoint grew larger ahead of them, and they could see soldiers raising their weapons, though whether to protect or threaten the approaching survivors was unclear. A loudspeaker crackled to life, broadcasting terse instructions. "Approaching survivors, maintain your current heading and prepare for immediate screening. Any deviation from the designated path will be considered hostile." Lisa stumbled, exhaustion finally overwhelming her determination. Michael immediately moved to support her, but the delay cost them precious seconds. The infected were now close enough that they could hear individual growls and the wet sounds of decaying flesh moving against itself. Katie screamed a warning as one of the creatures lunged toward Janet, its rotting fingers barely missing her shoulder. In that moment of crisis, Marcus understood that their survival depended not just on reaching the military lines, but on maintaining their humanity throughout the process. The infected represented the loss of everything that made them human, but the real test would be whether they could retain their compassion and unity in the face of systematic dehumanization by their potential rescuers. The military checkpoint loomed ahead, surrounded by razor wire and manned by soldiers whose faces showed no emotion. Behind them, the infected pressed closer, and Marcus realized that they were running not just toward salvation, but toward an uncertain future where their fate would be decided by others. The fight for humanity's survival had become a fight to remain human in an increasingly inhuman world. The soldiers at the checkpoint opened fire without warning, their automatic weapons cutting down the infected pursuing Marcus's group with clinical precision. The sudden violence was both salvation and horror, as bodies dropped mere feet behind the fleeing survivors. Emma screamed and covered her eyes, while Tyler clung to Ben with desperate strength. Down. Everyone down. The commanding voice brooked no argument, and the survivors threw themselves to the ground as ordered. Armed soldiers surrounded them immediately, weapons trained on the exhausted group while medical personnel approached with handheld devices that Marcus didn't recognize. The screening process was humiliating and terrifying. Each survivor was isolated and subjected to blood tests, temperature checks, and detailed physical examinations. Marcus watched helplessly as his makeshift family was separated into different processing areas. The children were taken to a special section staffed by medical personnel in full protective gear, their cries for their parents ignored by soldiers who had clearly been trained to maintain emotional distance. Colonel Sarah Martinez emerged from the command post, her bearing suggesting someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. She approached Marcus with businesslike efficiency, consulting a tablet that apparently contained information about their group. "I'm told you're the leader of this particular band of survivors," she stated rather than asked. "My medical team reports that all members of your group have tested negative for infection, which puts you in a very small minority." Marcus felt a glimmer of hope, but the colonel's expression remained carefully neutral. "The situation has deteriorated significantly since we established this checkpoint 12 hours ago. The infected population has grown exponentially, and our evacuation capacity is limited. We're implementing strict protocols to ensure that only the most viable survivors are transported to secure facilities." The words "most viable" sent a chill through Marcus's chest. Around him he could see other survivors being processed with the same cold efficiency. Families were being separated based on criteria that seemed arbitrary and cruel. An elderly man was directed away from his adult children toward a section marked with yellow tape, while a young mother was forced to watch as her infant was taken for additional testing. Lisa emerged from her screening area with tears in her eyes, immediately seeking out Emma and Tyler. The children had been classified as high priority, due to their age, which should have been good news, but the military's interpretation of priority seemed to involve separation from their parents. Michael and Janet were in heated discussion with a medical officer, their voices rising with desperation. Ben approached Marcus with grim news. "They're not taking me," he announced quietly. "Age-based screening protocols. Too old to be worth the resources they claim." His acceptance of this death sentence was perhaps the most heartbreaking thing Marcus had witnessed since the crisis began. But Katie made the cut. She'll be safe, and that's what matters. The injustice of the situation crystallized Marcus's understanding of their new reality. The military represented order and safety, but it was an order built on calculated sacrifices and utilitarian logic that reduced human beings to statistical probabilities. They had escaped the mindless hunger of the infected only to face the cold calculation of bureaucratic triage. As the processing continued, Marcus learned that their group would be split across multiple destinations. The children would be sent to a special facility designed for their protection and education, while adults would be assigned to work camps or research stations based on their skills and physical condition. The promise of staying together had evaporated in the face of military necessity. Colonel Martinez returned with final assignments, her voice betraying no emotion as she delivered news that would shatter their makeshift family. "The children will be transported to Safe Zone Alpha, approximately 300 miles north. Adults will be assigned to reconstruction efforts in various locations based on skill assessments and capacity requirements." Marcus felt the weight of leadership crushing down on him as he faced an impossible choice. They could accept separation and trust that the military system would eventually reunite them, or they could refuse and face the consequences of being classified as non-compliant. Around the checkpoint he could see what happened to non-compliant survivors. They were escorted beyond the perimeter and left to face the infected wilderness alone. The helicopter engines grew louder as transport aircraft prepared for departure. Marcus gathered his group for what might be their final conversation together, each face reflecting the same mixture of fear and determination that had carried them this far. They had survived the initial outbreak, formed bonds stronger than blood, and protected each other through impossible circumstances. Now they faced a different kind of test. The system that promised salvation also demanded sacrifices that challenged everything they believed about family, loyalty, and human dignity. Lisa took Marcus's hand, her grip conveying both gratitude and goodbye. Ben knelt to speak with Katie one final time, while Michael and Janet held their children with desperate intensity. The soldiers began separating families with practiced efficiency, But Marcus noticed something that gave him a spark of hope. Despite their training and protocols, many of the military personnel showed signs of discomfort with their orders. Humanity hadn't been completely eliminated by necessity, it had just been forced underground. As Emma and Tyler were led toward the waiting helicopter, Marcus made a silent promise that would define his actions in the days to come. He would find a way to reunite their family, even if it meant challenging the very system that had saved them. The fight for humanity's survival wasn't just about defeating the infected. It was about preserving the connections and values that made survival worthwhile. The helicopter lifted off with the children aboard, disappearing into the gray sky while their parents watched helplessly from behind razor wire. Marcus realized that their real battle was just beginning, and the enemy this time wore uniforms instead of rotting flesh. 3 weeks later, Marcus found himself in a work camp designated as Reconstruction Site Delta, located in what had once been a thriving manufacturing town in the industrial heartland. The facility housed nearly 2,000 survivors, all classified as essential personnel for the rebuilding effort. The irony wasn't lost on him that they were being forced to rebuild the same civilization that had failed to prevent the outbreak in the first place. The camp was a study in efficient brutality. Barracks housing was cramped and uncomfortable, meals were calculated to provide minimum nutrition, and work assignments were based on productivity quotas that seemed designed to break spirits rather than build communities. Marcus had been assigned to a demolition crew responsible for clearing infected overrun areas, dangerous work that claimed lives regularly despite safety protocols. Lisa had been sent to a different facility 3 states away, her teaching background making her valuable for the education programs they were developing for the New World Order. Michael and Janet were somewhere in the Midwest, working in agricultural development. The systematic separation of their group had been so complete that Marcus wondered if it was intentional, designed to prevent the formation of loyalty bonds that might challenge official authority. The only connection to his makeshift family came through Ben's daughter Katie, who had managed to get a message to him through an underground network of survivors who shared information despite official restrictions. The children were being well cared for in their facility, receiving education and psychological support, but they were also being indoctrinated with new social values that emphasized state loyalty over family bonds. Marcus had discovered that resistance was possible, but it required careful planning and absolute secrecy. A network of survivors throughout the various facilities had begun communicating through coded messages and contraband information exchanges. They called themselves the Reconnection, and their goal was simple: restore the human connections that the military system was systematically destroying. The leader of the local Reconnection cell was a former nurse named David Chin, who had lost his entire family during the initial outbreak but refused to accept that families should remain permanently separated. David had access to medical records and transportation schedules, information that proved invaluable for planning potential reunification efforts. "The system isn't sustainable," David explained during one of their secret meetings in an abandoned section of the work camp. "They're treating symptoms while ignoring the underlying disease. People need connections, need family, need hope. Without those things, we're just another kind of infected walking around without really living." Marcus had been skeptical of organized resistance at first, remembering the comfortable safety of following orders and avoiding trouble. But as weeks turned into months with no word about family reunification programs, he began to understand that compliance was just another form of giving up. The children were growing up in institutions, the adults were being worked to death in labor camps, and the human connections that made survival worthwhile were being systematically eliminated. The breakthrough came when David intercepted communications about a major transport operation scheduled for the following month. Children from several facilities were being relocated to a permanent settlement in Montana, a move that would make future reunification nearly impossible. The window for action was closing rapidly, and the Reconnection Network made the decision to attempt something that had never been tried before: a coordinated escape involving multiple facilities. Marcus volunteered for the most dangerous part of the operation: infiltrating the children's facility and extracting Emma and Tyler. His construction background and knowledge of building systems made him the logical choice, but the emotional weight of potentially seeing the children he had helped raise was almost overwhelming. If he failed, all of them would face consequences that made death seem merciful. The plan required precise timing and extraordinary courage from dozens of people across multiple states. Communication networks had to be established, transportation arranged, and safe houses identified. Most challenging of all, they had to accomplish this while maintaining their cover as compliant workers who had accepted their new roles in the military's vision of rebuilt society. As Marcus prepared for the mission, He reflected on how much had changed since that morning when he watched his neighbor devour the mailman. The infected had been a simple enemy, driven by basic hunger and instinct. The human systems that had replaced the chaos were far more complex and ultimately more threatening to everything that made life worth living. The night before the operation, Marcus received a final message from Katie through the underground network. The children remembered their makeshift family with love and were waiting for rescue, though they had been told their parents were dead. The casual cruelty of that lie strengthened Marcus's resolve and reminded him that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. He looked around at his fellow conspirators, people who had chosen to risk everything for the chance to restore broken connections and challenge a system that treated humans as disposable resources. They weren't heroes in any traditional sense, just ordinary people who refused to accept that love and family were luxuries that couldn't be afforded in the New World Order. Tomorrow would bring either triumph or catastrophe, but Marcus realized that the choice itself was what made them human. The infected had lost the ability to choose, and the military system tried to eliminate choice through control and manipulation. The reconnection represented something more dangerous than either: the possibility that humans could choose to remain human despite every pressure to surrender their humanity. As he prepared his equipment for the infiltration, Marcus understood that their fight had evolved beyond simple survival. They were fighting for the right to define what humanity meant in a world that seemed determined to reduce them to their most basic functions. The outcome would determine not just their own fate but the future of human civilization itself. Chat controls Sonnet 4.